there's something very unusual about the Haftorot that we read on this week and last week, and that is usually which Haftorah the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim read is based on 2 or 3 primary sources. Rambam wrote the specific Haftarot that apply to each weekly reading. Abu Darham, and for Ashkenazim the main source is Levush. It's interesting that the Shulchan Aruch does not discuss this at all. Only the Haftarot on the Yomim Tovim, the holiday days or specific special days, those Haftarot are discussed in the Talmud, in Masechet Megillah in the end, and of course the Shulchan Aruch quotes it, what Haftarah to read, let's say on Shabbat Chanukah. That will be the next unusual Haftarah a few weeks from now. But there is no discussion at all what Haftarot to read on regular Shabbatot. So the customs apparently were different in various places, and there are some differences still today. Between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, there are a few known weekly readings when Sephardim read one Haftarah and Ashkenazim read a different Haftarah. Sometimes Yemenite Jews have a special Haftarah, but mostly Sephardim follow Rambam and Abu Darham. If there are differences, sometimes there's a few different opinions brought in Abu Darham also. So at least that's the 2 main sources for Sephardim. And Ashkenazim follow Levush. Levush was a book that was written shortly after the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch literally means set table, which became the most accepted Jewish book of law. And Levush wrote for Ashkenazim a book instead of a commentary to Shulchan Aruch. He wrote his own new Shulchan Aruch and called it Levush, meaning a cloth. In a way, cloth is even closer to you than a set table. You eat on a set table, but the cloth is right on top of your body. So Levush was supposed to be, in a sense, it was supposed to replace the Shulchan Aruch, which it did not, but it became an important commentator. And there are certain things that only Levush discusses. This is one of them, the order of Haftarot. And in this particular case, the Haftarah of this week's Parsha is unusual in the fact that there seems to be an agreement between most of our sources which Haftarah to read, and that is the Haftarah from the Prophet Ovadia. This is a very short Haftarah. Ovadia, the whole prophecy is just like half a page or 1 page, whatever. It's a very short prophecy. He's one of the Trei Asar, the 12 what's called minor prophets, meaning 12 prophets that are written when things were written only on the scrolls, the prophets weren't printed yet, or even before the print weren't written in a book, they were written on a scroll. So every other prophet would be written on its own scroll, but the 12 minor prophets are all written on one scroll. And the Talmud discusses it, that if you'd have separate scrolls for each prophet, they'd be too small and they'd get lost easily. So 12 minor prophets, they all lived at different times, but they're all written together. They start with Hoshea and end with Malachi. 12 what's called minor prophets. Meaning they're short. And Ovadia is one of the shortest ones, maybe the shortest one. So the Prophet Ovadia is what was chosen for the weekly reading of Vayishlach, our Parsha. But interesting, there are some Ashkenazi Jews that read a different Haftarah in this week's Parsha, in particular, for instance, in England. This is very unusual. Usually Ashkenazim read the same Haftarah. There are differences, like I said, between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. But there's no real difference. As far as I know, there is no other Haftarah like that a weekly reading would have a Haftarah in some Ashkenazi communities, one Haftarah, and others another Haftarah. We do find real halachic disputes sometimes. For instance, if the Shabbat before Pesach, in which cases to read which Haftarah. That is a real halachic dispute, but there is no such thing as a regular Haftarah, a regular Shabbat, without falling on anything else, that various Ashkenazi communities would differ. Because we always follow Levush. So Levush says Haftarah is from Ovadia, and it's the same as Sephardic Haftarah. Yet if you take the Chumashim printed in England, for instance, one of the famous ones that used to be very widespread in the more modern Orthodox communities, it was called Sensina Chumash, with a commentary of Rabbi Dr. Hertz. That just was the Chumash almost 100 years ago, I think. It was a very old Chumash that was very widespread in various modern Orthodox communities. Today, it was largely replaced by other Chumashim, but this was the edition that was very well spread for the longest time. In Young Israel, I think synagogues, it was basically the Chumash, the main Chumash. And there it just says that Sephardic Haftorah is from Ovadia, but Ashkenazi Haftorah is something else. It's a passage from Prophet Hoshea. And in fact, what comes out according to this custom is that the passage from Hoshea that the Sephardim read last week, yesterday basically, on Shabbat before, on Parshat Vayishlach, is what the Ashkenazim read next week. Meaning, the difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim with regards to last week's Parshat Vayishlach is exactly which part of Hoshea to read. It's definitely at the end of Hoshea. Really, Prophet Hoshea, there are not so many Haftarot that are taken from it. There is a Haftarah from closer to the beginning of Hoshea that we read on Parshat Bamidbar. And then there is a Haftarah on the Shabbat before Yom Kippur, Shabbat Tshuva, what's called Shabbat of Repentance, where we take part of Hoshea. Actually, the same part at the very end of Hoshea, since it talks about Shuva Israel, come back Israel, do Tshuva. And last week, for Parshat Vayishlach, the Sephardim and Ashkenazim read different portions exactly, and there is a Chabad custom and other customs, but the main idea is that somewhere close to the end of Hoshea, who does mention certain episodes that are parallel to what the Torah described both in last Parsha and in this Parsha. So in a way, the various passages from Hoshea can fit both last Parsha and this Parsha. The Parsha of Vayishlach, where Yaakov goes to Padan Aram, to Syria to find a wife, and the passage where he struggles with the angel in this Parsha. Both of them fit nicely into the passages at the end of Hoshea. So the question is which passage to take from the end of Hoshea. So Sephardim take a passage that's slightly earlier, and Ashkenazim, the passage that's later, the end of Hoshea Mamash, the very end, the one that is read on the Parshat Tshuva. But other than that, there are some verses that are in both. In most congregations, there are certain verses that are said by both Ashkenazim and Sephardim. So it's just that where Sephardim end is where Ashkenazim begin, more or less, depending on the custom. But with regards to this British and certain other Ashkenazi community custom, of which have Torah to read, on this Parsha, Vayishlach, they read the earlier part. So last week, last Shabbat, those congregations read like all the other Ashkenazim, the very end of Hoshea, and then this Shabbat they would read the part that Sephardim read, meaning the part of Hoshea that's a little bit earlier, which, among other things, talks about struggling with the angel. So it's parallel to this week's Parsha. But like I said, it's very interesting that there is no old source. Usually everything is based on ancient sources in Judaism. We're very traditional people. And here there are some sources, obscure sources. If you look, for instance, in Wikipedia, it has an article on Haftarah in English and Hebrew and other languages, so that they bring some kind of source for this custom, but it's not an ancient source. Nothing like Levush or Abu Draham, so, hundreds of years old. These are relatively new sources. Obviously, the custom must have been older than that. The sources just recorded an existing custom. They didn't invent this Haftarah, obviously. But it's just interesting that there is such a difference, and that for some reason the congregations in England just don't follow Levush in this particular Parsha. I remember when I was in Princeton many, many years ago, when I was young, and at that time I just recently became religious, and I didn't know much. And I remember the people who knew more than me, and they had, among other things, the Chumash from Sensino, and the most standard Chumashim that are now much more widespread. And I remember they were arguing which Haftorah to read. And generally they decided that we're going to read the Haftorah, which Sansina only calls a Sephardic Haftorah. But like I said, it's really in America, as far as I know, all the congregations read this Haftorah, and this is the Haftorah that's based on the source from Levush and all other sources. In fact, the new edition of Rambam, what's called Frankel Rambam, where they have sources galore for everything. It's like a very nice edition where on every psak of the Rambam they bring both alternative sources and those who argue. And when Rambam lists various haftarot for various parshiot, for Parshat Vayishlach, for our parsha, they don't even bring any alternative at all there. So they completely ignore the English custom. And as I said, there is no really ancient source for it, at least recorded ancient source. So this is just this unusual thing about the Haftarah for this weekly parsha, that depending on which edition of the Chumash, you might not even be aware that there is a different custom. I mean, usually a Jew from England can come to America and vice versa and not find any differences whatsoever in the synagogue service or in anything else. And here there is one exclusion. As often, the exclusion only proves the rule, that all the other Haftarot, generally, there is a reasonable agreement among all Ashkenazim, and in most cases, Sephardim also follow the same Haftarah. The group that has unusual Haftarot, not in this particular case, but in many others, and that is what they call Romaniot. These are the Jews who came from the land of Israel to Greek Isles, and eventually they are widespread like other Jews, but there's a lot few of them. A lot more of them died during Holocaust. So, for instance, in New York, there's one synagogue that these people have. Of course, there's more people than the actual synagogue, but the rest of them don't have separate congregations. They probably just go to regular synagogues. So they have a very different order of Haftarot. In many parshiot, it's different from both Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And that edition of Rambam usually does bring, when there is a difference, it does bring. It's called what's Mahzoromania. Not to be mistaken with Romania, the country. It's not. They didn't really live in Romania. They lived further south. They lived somewhat in the Balkans and in the Greek Isles, I think, and some Italian communities. So these were the Jews that came directly from the land of Israel, and as opposed to a lot of exiles that came from Babylonia, these ones preserved the custom of Eretz Israel and their Haftarah quite often. A lot of their Haftarot, by the way, are taken from Yeshayahu, from Prophet Isaiah, for some reason. Our Haftarot also have a lot from Yeshayahu, but usually it's the Haftarot where at the end of, after the period of said 3 weeks, we have 7 weeks of reconciliation, and all these Haftarot are taken from the second half of Yeshayahu, from basically Vayet Hanan until Shabbat Shuvah, not including Shabbat Shuvah. So all the other Shabbatot there, we have usually 7 Shabbatot when we read these Haftarot. But other than that, there's not so many Haftarot from Yeshayahu throughout the year. There are more from Sefer Melachim, if not to count those 7. But in the custom of Romanians, most of the Haftarot are from Yeshayahu, it seems. And just last little point, that the word Haftarah or Haftorah has nothing to do with Torah. It's not Haf plus Torah, because it's written with a tet, not tav. Torah is written with tav, and Torah comes from teaching or Horah, Torah. These are the usually the word Torah in Torah itself is used to mean Torah of something. This is the Torah of this and this law, for example. Haftarah comes from maftir and all these other words. They come from the root of it's a different letter. Sephardim, in fact, distinguish the two letters tet. In English, there's no difference, so most Ashkenazim and European Jews generally lost the difference between tav and tet. But there is somewhat of a difference. At any rate, Haftarah is spelled with a tet, and it's not Haftorah or Haftara. It's not half with Torah. It's a completely different word, and its shorish, its root seems to mean some kind of an ending, or apparently, since it's close to the end of praying, and it's a finish of the entire reading of the Torah. So maybe that's the meaning here, that this is the end, the finishing up. But it definitely has nothing to do with Torah. But the idea was that at some point, the sages instituted that after every reading of the Torah on holidays and on Shabbat, not on weekdays though, except certain fast days. So, and on the big days of reading of the Torah, the Shabbat and the holidays, there would be a Haftarah. Some say it was instituted as part of the Gezeira. I'm not going to go into this. It seems more likely that it was instituted not because of some persecution, but simply because it made sense that after you read the Torah, you also choose some passage from the prophet, maybe related to the weekly parsha, or maybe related to this particular time, if it's a Rosh Chodesh, if it's Hanukkah, if it's something else, whatever the case may be. And on every holiday, it has to do with the holiday. So the Haftarah is just a finishing up of after the reading of the Torah. And if you like this video, please press like.